morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for what is sure to be a thought-provoking discussion. I'm Yvonne Distenfeld, a longtime board member and chair of the Development Committee, as well as a past vice president of Women's Philanthropy and past board member of the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington. My co-host Bonnie Prober and I, along with Jessa and Women's Philanthropy of the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, welcome all of you to Breaking Free of Family Trauma, a conversation with Gail Weiss Gaspar, author of Carrying My Father's Torch, From Holocaust Trauma to Transformation, and Karen Dixit, licensed clinical professional counselor and director of Jessa's Training Institute. Thank you to Jessa and to the Federation for partnering on this event tonight. I want to recognize Todd Shank, Chief Executive Officer of Jessa, who is joining us. Welcome, Todd. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank the amazing professionals at both the Federation and Jessa, without whom this event would not be possible. At Federation, Jessica Warren, Donna Corin, Paula Carrera-Silver, and Sarah Klein, as well as I want to shout out to the Federation board member and current Vice President of Women's Philanthropy, Carrie Iris. And at Jessa, Deborah Peebles, Julie Perlstein, Wendy Anderson, Matt Wagner, and also a great big thanks to my co-host and fellow Development Committee chair member, Bonnie Prober. And of course, a huge thank you to our special guests, Gail Weiss Gaspar and Karen Dixon. A few quick housekeeping items before we dive in. First, you'll notice at the bottom of your screen that closed captioning is available for this program. Also, we encourage you to submit questions for our speakers. Please use the Q&A function, also at the bottom of your screen, to submit your questions. And finally, tonight's event is being recorded and it will be shared with you after the program. As you know, this program is co-sponsored by Jessa and the Federation. Jessa and the Federation have been proud partners for decades, and I want to take a moment to spotlight two specific areas of their work together that are relevant to tonight's program. First, over the course of the pandemic, Jessa and the Federation have worked hand in hand to support our community as so many of us face new personal and family challenges. As more people struggle to access resources during the pandemic, Jessa partnered with the Federation to develop the J Caring Community Support Line, designed to take the guesswork out of accessing resources across the Greater Washington region. This support line has helped hundreds of people calling with questions about food insecurity, increased mental health issues, job loss, financial hardship. Jessa and the Federation also have been working together for years to support Holocaust survivors in our community. Through Jessa's Holocaust Survivor Program, more than 425 survivors, many who live below the poverty level, receive safety net, care management, home care, socialization programs, financial assistance, and access to pro bono dental, vision, and hearing services. Last week, we marked Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we were reminded that it is our privilege, honor, and responsibility to care for so many men and women in our community who survived the atrocities of the Holocaust to ensure that they live with dignity. Tonight actually marks the start of Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Day of Remembrance for the fallen soldiers and victims of terrorism. And tomorrow evening, Yom HaAtzmaut begins, celebrating Israel's 73rd Independence Day. The transition from remembrance to mourning to celebration, from atrocity and grief to optimism and hope in a span of just 1 week, reminds us of the possibilities to overcome trauma. An interesting thing about heirlooms, though sadly, I had none in the traditional sense. was that I inherited qualities instead of tchotchkes. What if heirlooms are not only ornaments and sepia photographs, but also legacy attributes waiting to be unpacked? Imagine if what's in the steamer trunk is a thorn, coaxing a persistent yet reluctant dream. That is how Gail Weiss Gaspar begins her new memoir, Carrying My Father's Torch: From Holocaust Trauma to Transformation. Tonight, we will hear how Gail grew up very much aware that her beloved father survived Auschwitz and the Mauthausen labor camp's brutal environment. Still, she kept her suffering in the steamer trunk and silenced her voice because nothing could match what her father had endured. Gail's family had secrets, as all families do. It became her job to be the family's secret keeper. It was not until her then 63-year-old father stood on stage at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for the very first time and told his story that Gail understood that her voice mattered too. Tonight, we hope you too will be inspired to consider how your family legacy has impacted your life. Perhaps you will be inspired to begin your own journey to explore your inherited legacies. And like Gail, to find your voice and become the hero of your own story. So with that in mind, it is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Please help me welcome Kieran Dixit, Director of Justice Training Institute and a licensed therapist, and my dear friend, Gail Weiss Gaspar, certified coach, executive career strategist, and author of Carrying My Father's Torch: From Holocaust Trauma to Transformation. Karen, I turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, and welcome, Gail. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. I'm grateful and honored to be with you and talk about your story. I want to start with these sentences from the foreword in your book about your story, where you say the story is of the loss of humanity, the story of hate, fear, violence, and inhuman suffering. And then it is also the story of finding humanity again, the story of survival, of living. Given what your father lived through and what is happening around us currently, how does one believe in humanity?
Well, first, I want to say thank you to Kieran and to everyone. And I do want to get to that question, but I also want to just thank a few people who brought me here. It's great to be here. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. I want to thank Yvonne for her warm welcome and her clear vision for this evening. She was an ambassador for my book from the start and an insightful early reader. And thank you to co-host Bonnie Prober. So much work goes on behind the scenes to plan and pull off a talk like this. And I would really be remiss to not thank Karen, to not thank you, and Wendy Anderson, who worked so closely with me, and to Jessa and Federation for co-sponsoring this event. So I do want to get to your question, and I will get to that now. And I'll just repeat it since there's been a little bit of time in between. So it's given what my father lived through, I think is what you said, and what's happening around us. How do we believe in humanity? What a big question, a big question to begin with. And my first response is stay away from the news. But beyond that, it's really tempting, and it's understandable, really, to sink or to retreat under the weight of hatred that we see on display. And my book is about inner strength and an open heart, and how it's even possible in dire circumstances. None of us get off free on this. We all carry beliefs and biases. Some we bring on ourselves, sure, but others, the biases don't belong to us. And the good news is that we get to protect, we get to decide really first what to do about it. And sure, it'll take engagement, it'll take vigilance and action to protect our freedoms and the beauty in our differences. But again, the good news is we get to decide. So like Yvonne, I'd like to ask you how bias or trauma from your own family may be limiting your own life, your perceptions, your actions, and to try to reimagine it in a new way. I found that it's a powerful shift that allows us to feel hope and to be part of the change. My dad, Marty, says that while he won't forgive the Germans for what they did during World War II and what they didn't do, he refuses to blame subsequent generations for their actions. So I learned an important lesson from him, but I also learned an important lesson that I tell in the book about generalizing and making assumptions about others. And in the case in the book, it's about the German descendants of the Nazis. So back to current day, I'm heartened really to see more people speaking up on behalf of injustice and particularly outside their own self-interest. And it's visible, particularly, I think, in the younger generations, in our children. So while I do see signs of where this could go, I'm hopeful.
Yeah, it's tough, but I think one of the things that I really enjoyed in your book is your father's unrelenting optimism and hope, and how much he insisted on instilling that in you and your brother. The importance of
I think it's
carrying
very
on.
conscious on his part, you know, both burying the past and keeping that from us, but also planting his own 2 feet and then the feet of his wife and his children in this new country with the optimism, with the freedoms that he felt by coming here, that were available by coming here.
Let's go back to, what made you write this book? I know that's probably a question you get asked all the time, but, can you speak to what it meant to you to write this book?
Yeah, I wish I had words to say how very much it meant to me and for how very long, because I ask anyone who knows me, I've always dreamed about writing a book ever since I can remember, because I've always kept a journal and I've read, I've read so many books and from the library and wherever I always had a book in my hand. So I always dreamed of writing it, but I had no idea what form it would take. And then 3 years ago, when I was considering what to write about, writing my story scared me like nothing else. So as we say in coaching, that became the story I needed to write first. Another thing was that my father, Marty, was 90 at the time, and I wanted him to be here to collaborate with me and to read it. I wanted my children to have an account from my perspective so that they could better understand our family history and their own choices in their lives. And there's a larger piece here as well. What I was seeing in our country and in the world was very disturbing. And I did not want history to repeat itself. And I hoped that my story could add something, especially when it came to showing how trauma reverberates through generations. It doesn't just affect the people who experience it. And I think that's, for people that don't have that in their family, it's really a tough thing to understand. So I feel like history is painfully relevant to what we're facing now. And for the first time, these factors all came together and gave me the sense of urgency that I hadn't had before to write the book.
One of the other things that stands out is, where you say discipline, independence, and reliability were the values that your father modeled to you. And those became internalized. Those, were rooted in you. And as an adult and as a mother, you really stuck by those. You adhered to those. How do you think, how was that discipline, that independence, reliability, how was that implemented in your home with your husband as you started a family of your own? And what did your husband and children think about that?
Yes, well, it's funny when you bring up the word discipline, the word that comes flowing into me is, or values, is the word productivity. Because my father was so obsessed with productivity and being productive that he would literally come into my room as a teenager even, chop, chop, wake up, the day's about to start, don't waste the day. And so it's taken so much time for me to break that down and to choose pieces of that I want to keep and pieces of that are not helpful for me at all. So that's the aside for that. But in terms of my husband and I, we talked about core values that we both inherited from our families, and we consciously made some changes and probably unconsciously kept a lot of things the same. His mother, my husband's mother, was a Holocaust survivor, and his father worked in the underground for Wallenberg. So we were quite a pair. He was raised modern Orthodox, and I was raised conservative. So we definitely had some navigating to do. And we were both brought up kind of more strictly than a lot of our friends. And we had a strict honor code in our house. We held family meetings where we'd review the week. So we'd recognize the kids for jobs well done, and we'd address their grievances and misbehavior. There were so many grievances, right? So it often devolved into that. And there was swift accountability when family values were breached. That I think was clear to them. So as parents, we did encourage independent thinking. We encouraged them to ask questions and to be curious about different people and places. And we were not always successful, but we tried to let them face consequences of their own decision-making, which is hard for parents to do. We continued what both our parents had done, our families had done, which is that weeknights and, well, for his words both, for me, it was just weeknights, but weeknights and Shabbat dinners were a dependable safe harbor from anything that was going on in school or anything that was, getting in their way. So one more thing I want to mention, since we're mostly in the local community, I think, is that at my husband's really insistence, but it was a mutual decision, we sent our children to JDS. I was a public school kid, and I always imagined my kids going to public school, even though I didn't get the greatest education. But I have to say that JDS did a great job of honoring values that were important to us. And the children did not always like it. Of course, they didn't. But all things together, including growing up with grandparents nearby, it helped lay a foundation for integrity and independence and a work ethic for how they were to live their life as adults.
Makes sense. There's, so many themes that resonate with me. And I'm wondering how many of these overlap with just being an immigrant and the immigrant experience. So much like, you have the Shabbat time that you had. At our home, we have implemented chai time.
Chai time.
Yes. So we have, though that morning time is very sacred. And if you want to be a part of that, it meant having to get up early.
It was only done on the early side.
Yes, it's always done in the morning because, even though in India we have tea in the afternoons as well, hardly anybody's at home. So that morning chai time is the sacred time. And what it meant to wake up early when no teenager wants to. And now, as my son grows older and is in his 20s, it's something he craves. And, if he's home, he will be present at the dining table at 7:30 a.m., no matter what has happened the night before.
Wow.
So it's
super interesting. I'll add there that our daughter, I think I have this in the book, that our daughter Stephanie told me in her young 20s that having Friday nights together was one of her favorite things about growing up. Who knew?
Yeah. After all that some
All the
agonizing moments.
everybody else was going to dances and they were going out at night and socializing.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's really interesting.
Gail, I'm wondering if you would like to do a poetry reading. I really like how that you woven that in the book, and the impact of those poems is so deep. Could you read one of your poems? I think the one that really resonated with me was Bird Song.
Absolutely. Thanks. So for those who might want to follow along with the book, we're on page 49 and it's section 18. And the poem is called Bird Song. Is it courage or urgency that brings me to this point of setting on fire story upon story? Tales of my childhood, unsaddling life of a heavy load not meant for carrying alone. Gone is the obedient girl who internalized loyalty, privacy, believed she had a right to only so much joy in the world. Born a daughter, I emerge as a mother, advocate for how we will live. I want to shout it and spread it from way up high. Wisdom born of age and brave, yes, though mostly it comes down to making life count, especially the ordinary moments. We are the lucky ones, we who are here. We get to choose how we will live now. Not everyone gets to hear the first bluebird sing of spring. Thank you. We can't hear you, Karen. I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, that's okay.
I can't unmute myself, so I have to remember that. The host is allowed to unmute me. So the one sentence that particularly resonates with me is that we get to choose how we live now. That's just so powerful. Right after this poem is, of course, chapter 19. And that one resonated with me in a very personal way. I see myself doing a lot of things your mom did, where she wanted to ensure and instill confidence in you. And she would praise you, and what was praised seemed like a burden. And for you, the struggle to decipher or to trust what is sincere versus what she's saying, and then always feeling like, can you trust the compliments, and learning to distrust them. And I think of myself as an immigrant and burdening my child and his pushback to praise and finding it lacking in authenticity, just like you did. And, somehow always struggling to fit in, to belong. Can you talk about how you managed to overcome that and own what was truly amazing about you? And any words of wisdom for us parents, as we struggle to remain authentic and yet, helping our children own who they are?
It's such a great question. And I only wish we would have thought of it earlier as parents, right? Because I knew that I didn't want to repeat that part of it. I loved and appreciated that my mother was always a cheerleader for me. But when I became aware that there wasn't that much, that I just became aware that it felt like blanket praise. And so it did tend to lose some luster there. And boy, our parenting is the hardest job ever. And, as those of us who choose to be parents, I want to believe that most of us do it to the best of our ability. And boy, those abilities really differ, but we want to try to do it well. And our lives are such a work in progress. If I could parent from this age backwards, I would do such a better job. right? But we don't know those things then. And
Mhm.
it's messy, and families are messy, and we make mistakes, and we get in our own way all the time. And I'll just repeat this until I'm blue in the face, I guess, is that the good news is we're never too old and it's never too late, to question and change what's not working. I say it in coaching all the time, and I try to live by that myself, because we so forget. We think we think our behaviors are so static, which many of them are, but there are key things that we can choose to focus on and prioritize, and try to stretch into a little bit.
Mm.
And so in thinking about this, the two things that really stand out, there's two life events that really stand out for me. Um, One was going away to college, because so few people in my town did. And the other was moving to Washington, D.C. without a job, without roommates, without really knowing what I was going to do. So surviving and getting through to the other side of those situations, they began to help me see myself. And I think I was pretty conscious of wanting to learn and stretch into places beyond the perceptions and the limitations of my own upbringing. And so when I started working for other people, and I started navigating a very nonlinear career path, when I started learning how to figure out feedback, like what do I take on and what to leave behind, some of these things became very useful to me in
Mm.
getting a sense of looking inside to myself, and not relying quite so much on external cues.
Mhm.
And you could see by the books behind me, I love books. They're my, if I had to take like one thing with me aside from my family and my dog, it would be my books. And I read and have read so much about self-leadership as an adult, and always look to surround myself with people who want the best for me and who support my growth, who don't try to keep me stunted in the way I was. And so all these are some of the things that inform my own understanding, my owning of who I was becoming.
Mm.
And just to pull this thread together, I think ultimately the best teacher was the experience of getting through the uncomfortable things, the hard things that helped me get a handle on what I was really capable of, the things I didn't think I could do that I did.
Mm. Yeah, I remember reading the portion where it was about when you made that decision to just move to DC and quit the job, and the support you got from your father. And what he said was, okay, it sounds like you're going to do what you need to do, and I'll support you, and I'll help you for 3 months until you land on your feet. Um,
Yes, and so it carries forward. And
mhm,
that we had to do that with our son who moved to California.
mhm.
We had to wish him well, give him a big hug, say we'll see you, and go do you. Go do you.
Mhm,
Yeah, the
mhm.
hardest thing about parenting for sure is letting them go.
Yeah, for sure. Um, is there anything you would say to your mom about her parenting and the praise if she was around? Is there anything you'd tell her to do differently, or would you keep that the same?
I I seem to remember trying to have this conversation with her in high school and in college, and it just we really didn't get that far on it, because she really deeply felt that she was of service to me by continuing to blanket praise me.
Mm,
And I came to feel like that was a disservice, because it wasn't helping me to distinguish between what was truly great and what was just okay or mediocre, or maybe not even good at all. so
mhm,
so I guess we could always go back to could go back to that table. But I think it all, so many things come down to the truth. Please just tell me the truth,
mm,
right? So tell me as it is, like not
mhm,
how you want it to be, but tell me how it is.
mhm. That's very deep. There is a request from the audience to tell a little bit more about your father's story of life before, during, and after the Holocaust. As you went through this journey of writing this book, what are some things that were kept so private? Did you learn about your father? What was it like? And what did he think about your book? What the
These are a
end
lot of
product?
questions. So can you pinpoint me in one question?
So let's start with your father's opinions. What was his takeaway after you finished writing the book about the end product? What did he say to you?
Well, the greatest thing was that he was in my family room when the proof came. So it comes, I'd been waiting, and my brother and my sister-in-law were here, my father was here, and we, I kept going to the mail, I kept going to the front door thinking it was going to be there, and then it probably was sitting in my mailbox for a day. But so I got it, I ran inside, and my husband had the presence of mind to turn on the video camera. And for those who just want to really feel good moment, you go to my Facebook page and you look at that. I think it's on my website too, perhaps, but you look at that tape of that video of how proud and how happy he was to be in that moment. You know, for one thing, you know, he was a collaborator. I would be able to go back to him and say, Dad, this is what I remember. What was it like? Or what, you know, can you set me straight here? So that was invaluable. Of course, it was great to be able to bond over a project with him. And two things I think on that is one is that he lives he lives in independent living, and whenever I go to visit him, he has this little satchel, and my bag is in it, and he always says, "Look, I have your book. I'm reading it again." And this has been going on for 6 months since my book was published, and it's like the cutest thing. He loves it. One thing I want to say though, because it comes back to stretching ourselves and our fathers, is that he read the book and he came back to me and he said, "Boy, you really tell a lot in that book. You really reveal a lot in there." And I said, "Yeah, well, I had to, it's a memoir. Like that's what memoirs do. Like I needed to talk about what was happening and what it felt like to me." And he thought about it and he said, "Yeah, I guess that's true. Like without telling those things, like you really wouldn't have much of a book, would you?" So it's uncomfortable for him, but at the same time, he gets it. So I feel like we're all growing from this reveal of taking this information and this, and it is a big reveal with a capital R, because we were a private family, a family of secrets. So you can only imagine how angsty it was for me to write this and to hand it over to someone else who was going to be editing it and putting it out in the world. It was a scary thing.
I know that in your book, I think it's very, very much in the beginning, where you asked him about, you know, his story. I think it's in the book. Who would want to hear my story? He said when you asked him, I think. And now that as he's read it, is there anything else he's revealed about his time, you know, being at Auschwitz and what it was like for him? Is there a much more openness to whether his grandchildren ask him or you ask him? Do you feel like as a result of this book, he's in a different place and perhaps a little more open?
You know, I think that his openness began when he started speaking with the museum. He was telling his story day in and day out, like sometimes 3 days a week, you know, traveling all over the country and to other countries, telling his story. And so it's all out there. I mean, it's in every form of media, and he got very used to telling his story. I mean, I think what people have told me, because I interviewed a lot of people for the book, what they've told me is that what distinguishes him from as a survivor is his story is always fresh and it always lands fresh in people's ears. It doesn't feel like it's been said hundreds of times before. That, and you could see that on him, because it's he relives it, you know, every time. So have things come out over the years when I've been, you know, heard him speak? Of course. Have things come out for the book? A couple things, when he talks about his animals and having to leave his animals in the book. That was so tender. And you know, you could really see the young boy for whom that would be such a big hole in his heart. But for the most part, he lives in here in Rockville, and I'm with him a lot and have been with him a lot on all his tours, and a lot of tours and talks and things. So I wouldn't say anything's come out, and he's very forthcoming. Anybody who asks him for interviews, or when my kids ask him, he's very forthcoming about telling, and he remembers, of course, at this age, you remember everything in the past. So he really has an amazing memory.
Wow. What would you say was the hardest thing about writing this book? And what do you think you know now that you didn't know before?
I love this question, because I know when I go to talks, and I go to a lot of author talks, it always sounds so easy, like, oh, they just sat down and wrote a book or something. And that's just not the way it is. So the hardest thing was believing that I would finish it, because I had had this dream for so long and it was incomplete. It was not even started, really. I mean, it was in notebooks and things. So there's that. Taking my story from private to public was really hard. And, you know, it's just like when you press send on a really difficult email, and, you know, pressing send, here's my manuscript, to my editor. It's like, oh, just let me take it all back, you know, because it just feels so exposed. It feels like just running through cold rain with, you know, nothing to cover you. I was afraid of hurting people who I loved. I had to face painful truths, and I had to go beyond what I thought I knew and what I thought was limiting me, in order to update the impact of my legacy story, because I had never looked at it from my perspective before. And I just learned so many things, hopefully of value to people here. I learned to follow this dream that wouldn't quit me, despite my best efforts to keep it in. And I always knew that resistance and this inner critic that goes on in our heads, I always knew that was a beast, but I learned a little bit about taming it. And that was a really interesting process that took quite a while to figure out for myself. I learned to look at my parents more multidimensionally, Karen. I think I tended to look at them, you know, that they had so much love for us. But I realized that I carried their silence and their shame, as well as that love and devotion. I realized that I didn't need to keep myself from living my best life in order to honor painful memories. That was just a construct that I made up in my head. I guess connected to that is that writing for me is not a luxury. It's really life affirming, and that I didn't need to do it perfectly. I just needed to do it, and I needed to finish it. And I guess one more thing that I didn't know that I wish I had known is how it would serve readers, like people who are reading this book from different walks of life, and they're taking action. They're writing letters to their children now about their history. They're having some hard conversations. Some are changing jobs, and others are moving to new places because they realize they've been stuck, and they realize they have a choice to change. And partly they said that looking at the questions in the back of the book have helped them to meet themselves there, about what action needs to be, who they want to be next, and what actions can take them there.
What would your life be like if you hadn't written this book?
Mm. It would be very sad. No, it wasn't sad before, but I lived with an unnamed and unacknowledged trauma. And I lived all these years with the assumption it was my father's story, not mine, to tell.
Mm.
What would my life be like? What comes to mind is angst
Mm.
for not having done it. These are just the words that are flying around here: hidden,
Mm.
silent,
Mm.
smaller, incomplete. I really did have a deep hole inside around what was not expressed in me.
Mm.
And as a result of this expression and writing the book, I've met, amazing people. I've had incredible opportunities. If I didn't free our story, I wouldn't know how many other people need to hear it.
Mm.
And I wouldn't feel as free. And my book wouldn't be available at the Holocaust Museum in Yad Vashem if I didn't write it, right?
Mhm.
There's that.
You spoke about trauma, and I want to talk a little bit about trauma. One of the things that we do at JASA is make sure that regardless of what department, what program area we're in, that we're person-centered and trauma-informed in our approach to providing care to anybody that seeks care from us. What do you think, what was important for your father in successfully dealing with his traumatic experiences? How do you think he did it? Cope with what he had done? Clearly, he had, you've spoken about the work ethic and the store and those values of hard work and discipline. Do you think those were coping mechanisms? How do you think he actually coped with the horrific reality he had endured?
Yeah, I'm thinking about this as in it's not a one size fits all thing for sure, but I think there are some universal tenets, some universal foundational skills that can help people to overcome trauma. I wouldn't suggest really doing what he did initially, which was like pushing it inside and not talking to anyone, including his family,
Mm-hmm.
about it. But that's the way he went about it. It's what he needed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked okay for him. So I wouldn't recommend keeping it inside. I think that it's really important not to go it alone. And you could say this about any creative endeavor. You could say this about trauma. You could say it about life, right? That there's so much ado about the independence of doing things yourself. And it's so crazy and overrated, because part of the joy of writing my book was the community and the team that I brought together to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And in my mind, might add that I thought maybe one of the reasons I didn't do it earlier is because I thought that I had to do it only alone. Like, of course, I had to write it alone, but I thought, like, I had to learn everything and I had to do everything myself.
Mm-hmm.
Who would want to do that? Like, that's overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that always getting in touch with values is always a great idea. It's what I do first in coaching all the time, because it's really the foundation from which to move.
Mm-hmm.
And also, to just really chuck to the curb the notions of perfectionism and giving that inner critic in our head too much space, to tell us we're no good, or it's too late, we can't do something. And it really helps to have some accountability. Again, back to the thing of not doing it alone. Like, you're sad, you're having a hard time, you have issues, just to let it out some way. So for some people, maybe it's drawing or painting. For me, it's writing. For somebody, it's singing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or dancing. there's so many ways, but it's so important. It's so important not to keep it bottled up, to allow, to give yourself permission to turn on the release valve, that we don't need to carry it all alone. It's too big a burden.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Often those with traumatic experiences, there are consequences of whether, with what they choose to do with it, right? I mean, there's a consequence for choosing to cope with it in the myriad of ways that you mentioned. And then there is consequences for choosing to suppress and not give it the outlet that may be healthy. But each one comes at it from their own past, seeing how their family dealt with it or did not deal with it. And I wonder what you would suggest for those, much like yourself. There's generational trauma, and how do children such as yourself, what are some takeaways? It sounds like you have mentioned the writing process, what was healing for you. There could be other art forms. Is that what you'd recommend for those that are first generation?
Yes, I would recommend an outlet that brings you joy. Not a high barrier to entry thing, something that you like to do or you used to like to do. Like a lot of people who even come to me for coaching take up musical instruments and painting and stand-up comedies for some reason for the first time, right? As outlets. And it's terrifically healing in its own right, the process of just taking these emotions and expressing them. And just going to see if I can find that little, I think I took the bookmark away to that little passage we were going to read about expression. I think it's so good here.
Yeah, I was.
But it's just a couple lines. Can I read it now?
Yeah, please do.
I think it's a fitting reading for here. So it's page 61, number 22, for those who have the book. What breaks my heart is life unexpressed. I've suffered under the spell of keeping it all in. Yet, dare I call it suffering?
Yep. And in going back to the lightness that you mentioned and comedy, the importance of laughter and creating that lightness in what was, unimaginably horrific, and to see how that can be such a wonderful release. And laughter is often undermined or dismissed, but it is such a great way to cope. And it really provides a nice avenue.
And I think it opens up this, kind of peels the orange here of the fullness of an experience, whether it's a happy or a tragic experience, there's fullness there, and the ability, the willingness to explore the different facets of it. So, there might be a learning we take away. There might be some aspect, something that happened before that's associated with it that was actually quite nice. Like what is the fullness of feeling there, so that so that we're not sinking just with the feeling of trauma, but that we're kind of pushing out the edges a little bit to experience the more fullness of what we feel. There's more there. Like what else? I always ask, and what else? What else is there?
And such a great way to kind of push ourselves to also do that internal reflection by saying, what else is there for me? And how can I, move past it? And so, just constantly being in touch and being in that place of inquiry can take you such a long way.
You make a great point, because really quickly on that, I just want to point out that so many of us look externally, we look outside ourselves for validation or next steps or what we can do. And the process of looking in, it takes, it doesn't take that long, but so many of us are so busy. I was one of them, so busy with doing and doing and doing that we forget to check in with ourselves. We forget that we can be quiet, not turn the music on in the car, not be talking on the phone when we're walking, when we're taking a walk in the woods, to really just settle in with ourselves and see what's there, you know, see what wants to emerge.
Can you take us behind the scenes about your story, what it felt like to write, what came up as you were writing, maybe in those moments when you were in that place of inquiry and this quiet as you were going through the writing process?
I did a lot of, not all, but I did a lot of the writing in this room in my office. And what was the most challenging? There were two things that were the most challenging to me. One was to allow myself a regular writing practice. I was very, very wiggly about the writing practice. And so one of the things that helped me do that is this little, very inexpensive kitchen timer, which I would set, and I would say, I'm going to sit until until I write for 25 minutes, and I would do 25-minute increments. So at first I couldn't sit for 5 minutes. Literally, I was up from the chair. It was like, I don't know what to put on this page, but I just can't be here. It's too uncomfortable. So it was very, very uncomfortable to approach those blank pages, even though I'd written journals forever. This was, I felt like I had to reframe this whole thing as, and basically get into a place where the writing became more about devotion, really, than it was about knowing. Right? Because I always wanted to know, what am I going to write and what's going to come out of it? And of course, there's no way you can know, but when that's your expectation for a successful writing session, really there's no reason to start, because you're writing into what you don't know yet, right? Taking things and seeing where they're going to go. So that was very, very difficult for me. And it was just very difficult to mine some of these painful memories and some of my cluelessness of, how long can you go and not really figure this out? Or, I mean, I never considered that the trauma was passed along to me for so many decades. Like, that was just not something that was even in my consciousness. So it was really like, it was really a deep dive into being with myself alone. Many hours, not knowing what I was going to do, until I created an environment that supported me. So, I mean, that's a whole thing in itself, which was fascinating to me, because I was doing kind of mostly wrong things, things that were not inviting me to write until I figured it out.
Wow. I liked how you said, it was about devotion, and that's very poignant. I can't believe that we are coming to the end. I know that Bonnie has words that she would like to share before we end. I just want to end with your words from the prologue. My hope is you will feel compelled to face your legacy wound and use it to create a meaningful life for ourselves and others at any age or stage, and that we learn to repurpose the pain to become a more authentic, confident, and sovereign version of yourself. How incredibly poignant and kind those words are, Gail. Thank you for being with us this evening. I'm honored to be with you and to have the opportunity to engage with you. And I'm thankful for the audience for being here and for being present as you shared your experience. And I'd like to now hand it over to Bonnie.
Thank you, Karen.
Good evening. I'm Bonnie Prober, and I'm a member of JESSA's Development Committee and one of your co-hosts this evening. First, let me take a moment to thank Gail and Kieran for such a compelling and meaningful conversation. I think we can all relate to the impact our parents' life experiences have had on our own perceptions. We hope that you too can find your voice and begin these conversations with your own family. If you would like to purchase a signed copy of Gail's book, From Carrying My Father's Torch, From Holocaust Trauma to Transformation, please use the information in the chat this evening, in the Zoom chat, and you'll be able to purchase a signed copy of your book if you click on that link by this Friday, April 16th. If you're interested in learning more about JESSA's Holocaust Survivor Program and how to support Holocaust survivors in our community, you can log on to JESSA's website at jssa.org. On behalf of myself, Yvonne, and our friends at JESSA and Women's Philanthropy of the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, thank you for joining us this evening. We hope you'll join us for JESSA's Community Impact event on June 3rd, Turning the Tide on Mental Health Stigma. If you're interested in getting more information, you can log on to jssa.org/turn the tide. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of your evening.